Hello, SMS friends. I'm Martin Reeves. I'm your host for today, and I might be joined by my co-host George Stork, but he's somewhere stuck over the Sea of Japan, between Korea and Japan. So you're stuck with me for a minute. So welcome to another session of the SMS Strategy Imagination Forum series. It's the third year of the series, I believe. And just to remind you, if any of you are new, that the idea is to put on cutting-edge strategy issue talks by accomplished thought leaders, but not just from academia, business, and consulting, returning to the SMS's mission of being an applied discipline and celebrating practice as well as theory. This ties into the 6 big questions of strategic management, which I think will be posted in the chat as we speak. And the idea of that is that to make sure that the SMS and academics are working on the issues that are relevant to practitioners, the SMS has framed these 6 questions as being the areas where we need to make more progress. So today's talk ties nicely into that. It's about all of the things that are going on in the evolution of work, and I'm delighted to introduce today's speaker, Debbie Lovich, who you can see on the screen. She's a managing director and senior partner in the Boston Consulting Group. She's a BCG fellow, researching the topic of the future of work. At BCG, she's served on the executive committee, and she's actually practiced what she preaches. She's helped BCG to embrace new ways of working. In BCG, there's a scheme called PTO, Predictability, Teaming, and Open Communication, that was put together in collaboration with colleagues at Harvard Business School. And Debbie has been implementing and refining that, which I think is a major contribution to BCG being consistently ranked as one of the best places to work. So Debbie's a thought leader on the future of work, and she researches and consults on organizational issues more broadly. So the plan for today is I'm going to hand it over to Debbie now, and she'll speak for about 30 minutes, and then we'll have a good 20, 25 minutes for questions. And you can already be thinking about your questions and post them, not in the chat, please, post them in the Q&A on your screen. So thanks for doing this, Debbie, and over to you.
Oh, of course. Thanks for having me, Martin, and nice to meet everyone. And delighted to share some of our thinking and my research on the topic of the future of work. Although, Martin, I don't love to call it the future of work because the future is now. So instead, I like to call it making work work, or how work should work. And so let me just share my screen, and I'll put up, those are my lovely family, but let me put up the presentation. Here you go. So how work should work. And I'm going to cover a lot in the next 30 minutes. And Martin, please, keep me on time a bit, but I'll try and cover, well, why does it even matter? And then, really try and, frame how we think about making work work. And most importantly, well, what do you do about it? What should organizations be doing about it? So into why it all matters. And I know there's all this talk about recession, but the numbers don't play that out, right? And we keep these up to date with all of the latest jobs data. So here on the left, you have the global unemployment rate, as low as it ever was. And you could see, 2 of the recessions. I've been at BCG 29 years. So I've lived through, both of these recessions. The COVID, peak in unemployment disappeared into the Great Resignation really quickly, right? And on the flip side, you have job vacancies. And while they're coming down a bit, with layoffs, they're still way above what they were historically pre-COVID. And in fact, in the US, for example, there's 1.7 open job for every person looking. And that assumes a perfect match of skills, right? And even in the tech industry, where you're seeing all these layoffs, the tech unemployment rate or occupation rate, right? The unemployment rate, is lower than the national average of unemployment rate. So there's still, right? A very tight labor market. And when you look at the massive tech layoffs that have been going on, only 40% of those are actually tech. A lot of it were more management or recruiters or other roles. And that tech talent are quickly getting back to work. 80% almost find a job within 3 months. And so it's, it is still a tight talent market. And so, the way I like to put it is the war for talent is over, talent has won. And now organizations need to think about how to attract and recruit and retain and inspire and motivate talent more than they ever have done. And in fact, if you look at employer agendas, right, and what's driving it, again, attracting talent is at, a real high in terms of, employers reporting difficulty finding the talent they need. So that's a little bit on why, we think about making work and making work better. And, I also want to take a minute to talk about, this topic, the fact that this topic's not new, okay? People have been trying to make work and make it better for a long time. Martin talked about some of, my own efforts here at BCG that we started back in 2008. But, things around flexible work, gig talent, digitizing, always on learning, growth mindset. Satya Nadella really, brought that into the corporate world when he became CEO of Microsoft. And really used that to drive the culture of Microsoft, famously saying we need to go from a know-it-all culture to a learn-it-all culture. Measuring impact instead of input or face time. Agile ways of working have been going on for a while, trying to change cultures to not be command and control anymore, but to be more, autonomy under an aligned and inspired vision, right? And so those of us who work in, organizational health have been focusing on these things for a long time. But I have to say, working on these have been like pushing boulders up a mountain, right? It was really hard work. If anyone tried to work flexibly, pre-COVID, it was like you automatically were like disenfranchised and intermediated from where the real conversations were happening, viewed on a mommy track or just not committed, right? And so, but we made progress, slow progress. But what COVID did magically is it basically took that mountain we were pushing the boulder up and flipped it downhill. And all of a sudden that boulder came crashing down and we had to do all these things. We had to work flexibly, not just in place, but in time, right? We had to deal with the kids when, they were trying to get online and learn and needed help. Talent became fluid. Not only did, people move across companies. I have clients where the retail bankers moved into call center, insurance clients where the vision and dental claims managers moved into health claims. But you also see in China, during COVID, employees were shifted around organizations to help out where help was needed. We saw very clearly everything, all those paper processes that needed to be digitized, right? We had to learn every minute. We didn't have time for formal learning. No one went to a training course on how to use Zoom better and more effectively. We just had to dig in and do it, right? We had to measure impact. We had to trust people. And everyone went agile, whether they realized it or not. And, we didn't have time for things to go up and down the PowerPoint massaging chain of command. And so work got better in many ways all of a sudden. Now, it also got worse in many ways. Burnout, no barrier between work and home, stress, all got higher. Of course, it was a pandemic, right? And so, but what's fascinating to me is none of these things are new, right? COVID unlocked the potential and everyone started living this way. And for some reason, all of the world's focus on flexible work has been on this one little piece on the upper left, flexible work in place, days per week in office. If you read the paper, it's all about return to office, if you go into management team meetings, how many days a week? Are we going to be hybrid? When do we force people back? And the world is ignoring all the other aspects of work that can be better and the different ways to make work better. And so this is too narrow in two ways. One, flexible place of work, days per week, return to office, only pertain to the 20 to 30% of the global workforce that is office-based, right? I don't like the word white collar or blue collar or, knowledge worker. What does that make everyone on, who's not based in an office, like a not knowledgeable worker? And so we use the words, for lack of better terms, office or desk-based, those who could take their laptop home and work, or could work from anywhere with an internet and a laptop, versus those who need to be physically present to do the work that we call deskless or frontline. Okay. And we know from our research, back to the Great Resignation, that, both these types of workers, by the way, are at risk of leaving their job. A small portion actively looking, but a large portion saying, hey, if something better came my way, I for sure would take a look. So again, days in office, too narrow, because that's only 20 to 30% of the workforce. And as per the prior page, it's also too narrow in terms of levers to make work. And so, let me share a framework that we use quite a bit in how we think about making work. One is talking about how we work, right? How you interface with customers. I have one client where their inside sales, business to business sales representatives were dying to get back in field to sell with customers. Well, guess what? Their customers didn't want them back. They enjoyed the convenience of more electronic interactions. And so they want to keep that. There is the work models, the hybrid, for office workers in 1.2, but there's also flexibility for deskless workers, those tied to location that we need to think about. If you expand the definition of flexible work to not just be flexible place, but also flexible time, you will see that the work models, can start to apply, to deskless workers, right? You could think about shift marketplaces, different shift schedules. I, read about a hospital, but simply moving the nursing shift from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. to 10 a.m. to 10 p.m. The nurses were much happier. They weren't quitting. They were more engaged. Why? Because it's easier to get a babysitter in the evening than in the morning, right? 7 a.m. shift, that's a real hardship on the family, whether you're a male or female nurse, right? So work models, thinking broadly about that. And then ways of working. Something magical happened, in COVID. All the low value work disappeared. We only focused on what mattered. And we were constantly restacking the priority of work and reevaluating what's the most important thing. Why are the old administrivia type things moving back into? We also worked much more agile, cross-functional, agile teams. You didn't need a zillion people in on every meeting. You just needed the people needed to get it done, right? So there's a whole broad agenda beyond days per week in the office around how we work. There's a second, equally important, if not more important agenda around how we lead. A concept called generative leadership that came out during COVID. I'll explain what that is. Using purpose and driving culture, and then role in society. You can no longer just care about your employees. It's more about their families, the communities, carbon, social unrest. All of those things, are a broadening corporate agenda that has to really think about their place in society and not just delegate that to governments and nonprofits to deal with. So that's how we lead. And then finally, how we organize. We saw a lot of fluidity during COVID. We saw a lot of, cross-functional teams naturally forming together to get things done. Well, why not hardwire that into what we call the adaptive organization? agile at scale, platform organization, ecosystems of organizations that work fluidly with partners, right? How do we make our operating models, a corporate operating model itself, much more fluid? Next, more diverse talent models. So, think about it, like, I don't want a job, I just want to go project to project. That's sort of what happened again, at the beginning of COVID. And imagine if you move project to project based on interest, learning objective, and business need, right? What happened when people shifted across the organization during COVID to pitch in? They learned, labor was used more productively, they broke down silos, and they built their personal networks. Not bad. Why not bring that in? Always on learning. I talked about that, a learn it all versus a know it all. Make every interaction, an opportunity to build skills explicitly, having leaders coach instead of tell. So there's lots around, just the organization or operating model. And then finally, what we need. So employee value proposition, I alluded to that at the beginning. I'll talk more about that. We need to attract and retain employees and think about that. Just like you think about attracting and retaining customers and customer value proposition. What does it mean for space and travel and location? The office is now a place for gatherings and meetings and collaborative work. That's very different than cubicles and small offices. And then finally, tools and technology. So this is, we are digitally overwhelmed. We have many channels, right? Zoom, Teams, WebEx. Do I get messages by Slack, by message, by WhatsApp, through the chat on the Zoom? Like, can we align on what tools do we use? Almost like, what is our communication and collaboration stack? But also thinking about now the role of AI and generative AI to rethink the low value work and find other ways to get it done. So I raised this, large, and here it is with some of the detail behind it that I voiced over. The purpose of this is not to overwhelm you and say, oh my goodness, there are a million things we have to think about. The purpose is to point out that rethinking work is in fact a system. It is a system. And like any system dynamic, you need to prioritize your intervention point, but you need to recognize that it's not standalone. So what I'm not saying to organizations is you need to spin up, 12 teams to deal with these things. What I am saying is, understand where you are, prioritize where you want to intervene, but then recognize that they're connected. For example, it's very hard to drive agile ways of working, iterative teaming, prioritizing what matters if you have a very rigid command and control organization. So you may dive in here at first, but eventually you'll get to 3.1. Right. So what I wanted to do is dig a little deeper in three that come up quite a bit. And I'll start with employee value proposition. And I just wanted to share some really interesting research that we've done. Again, I said at the beginning, the war for talent's over, talent's won, and now every organization needs to approach talent just like they approach customers. And what does that mean? It means rigorous research, design thinking, employee journeys, right? Reimagining the experience, segmentation. Not all customers are alike. Personalization, segmentation has been around for decades. Yet when it comes to employees, we treat them all like they're exactly the same. Guess what? We're all different, right? What motivates me is very different than what motivates Martin. Trust me, we go way back. So let me give you one example of thinking about the insights you get when you think about employees like customers. So here's some typical employee research. I did it myself, right? Through two research tools. We asked, people, I had these numbers earlier, how many of you are looking or thinking of leaving your job? And then, we asked them, well, what are the reasons, what are the reasons you're leaving? And you'll see both for office-based and deskless workers, they're pretty similar. Pay, career advancement, benefits, they're mostly functional, but there's some emotional ones in there too, feeling listened to, right? Feeling supported here, culture, but mostly functional at the beginning, right? And then what we did is we asked people, we took some consumer research technology in and we asked people, to do trade-offs, like it's a max diff or conjoint analysis, to say, okay, that's what you said was important, but if you actually, are forced to choose, what would happen? And you could see pay and compensation still number one. I'm going to choose a job based on pay, but flex and work-life balance moved down to 5, work that I enjoy, feeling fairly treated, feeling valued and appreciated, jump up to 2, 3, and 4. Mastery, feeling like I'm good at what I do, right? Number 6 here. And so just like consumers, we as employees have functional and emotional needs. But when most organizations think about employee value proposition, they just think about the functional needs and not what it feels like, right? What it feels like to work there. So, and then we went one step further and we said, okay, this is when you're forcing them to make trade-offs and actual decisions, right? This is what they trade off. But then what we did is we did, a pretty big correlation analysis amongst 30 different aspects of work. So in the survey, we asked people just how satisfied they were, with these 30 different dimensions of work. We then correlated that to their intention to stay or intention to leave, that 43%, 55%. We correlated to that. And what we see, so these are the rank order from the page before, right? Pay and comp, number 1, doing work you care about, 2, fairly treated, 3, valued and appreciated, 4, work-life balance, 5, right? That was on the page before when you force the trade-offs. But when you do the correlation, the order shuffles again. And what's fascinating is, emotional needs around relationship, feeling supported, feeling listened to, they jump higher in the rank, and functional needs, hours and pay, fall lower in the rank. And so the way I interpret this is to say, okay, to recruit people, you have to, appeal to what's in their cognitive mind, how they make the trade-offs, but to keep them, you have to appeal to their subconscious, the emotional needs, the things that matter day to day, which totally resonates, right? People say, I don't quit a company, I quit a boss. Or a good day is when someone says, you know what, Debbie, you did a great job. That was amazing. A shitty day is when someone says, Debbie, I think you really flubbed that, and don't give you any detail or any coaching or anything about it, right? And so these emotional things really drive it. Okay, I could go on about this forever. I know I said we were going to talk for half an hour. So let me flip to the next one. So that was employee value proposition. I want to double click and explain what we mean by generative leadership. And, we came up with the term generative leadership with an article we wrote over a year ago. And we could send that out if we haven't already, way before ChatGPT and generative AI came all over the place. And I'll argue, and you'll see why, if we used our definition of generative leadership for generative AI, we'd have less to worry about. And so let me explain what we mean by generative leadership. Think of it in, leaders used to be extractive, right? Use people as a means to an end, pay you just enough to get most of your waking hours during the week, right? Take resource from the ground and pollute. I mean, that is extractive leadership. The world has moved to sustaining net zero, work-life balance, but what we're arguing is that we actually have to move further to generative, and that means making everything you touch better off. And so your mindset as a leader, a truly generative leader, is how do I make everything I interact with better off? And that's a shift. That's a real shift. And, and we break down generative and better off to explain it further into, what we refer to as the head, the heart, and the hands of leadership. So a generative leader, thinks about their core business strategy and says, how do I reinvent that? So at the core, I'm not just serving profit and shareholders, but I'm serving people, planet, community, society, right? So it's not like a little ESG off to the side. It's in the core. Enel, the Italian utility companies, a great example of that. They're like the #1 in green energy, but they were a classic old utility company, but they reinvented their core. They've done over 1,000 external partnerships or acquisitions, ideation. My nephew, who's like a rock star engineer out of Dartmouth, could have gone to any green tech company he wanted to. He went to Enel, right? They've reinvented themselves in the head, in the core. The heart is inspiring, caring for people like 24/7. It is how you show you care in every interaction, not just for the employee, but for their families. Fran Katsoutis, who is the chief people officer at Cisco, who is constantly on the best place to work lists. I think they were #1 this year. She talks about even before COVID, their philosophy as an organization is we care for every one of our employees and their families 24/7. That is their mindset. I worked with a manufacturer, to give you another example of this, who moved from family benefits to household benefits because a lot of their immigrant worker employees were caring for their cousins, their grandparents, their nieces. And so direct family member healthcare didn't help them, right? So they moved to household benefits. So that's hard. And then finally, generative enhance. So this is, moving with agility and speed through what we say supercharged teams. So this is not just, cross-functional teams within an organization, but also outside of an organization. I think Pfizer and what Albert Bourla and the Pfizer team did to get the COVID vaccine out in months instead of the years it would normally take is a great example of generative enhance. And two things in particular I would point out about them is that one, they worked with a lot of public data, like the whole COVID, science was out there in the public domain. They're normally very secretive about how they do clinical trials. And second, they worked with tiny little biotech, right, to produce the vaccine. Pfizer normally doesn't partner with external partners. They normally gobble them up. Pfizer Wyeth, Pfizer Pharmacia, Pfizer Warner Lambert, all those mergers. Where it's a merger of equals, but the new company will be called Pfizer, right? So this was really new for them to work in partnership and with someone so much smaller than they were. So that's just a great example of generative hands. So this is pretty high aspiration, right? Generative head, generative heart, generative hands. The thing about that is it is impossible for any one leader to be generative in all those aspects, right? And the other thing we say about generative leadership is it's a team sport because of that. And so the role of a leader, a CEO, is not to be the hero anymore, but is to assemble the diverse team of athletes that can lead in all of these dimensions. I will say one quick thing about heart. Heart is the most overlooked attribute of leadership in general, yet it's the most wanted. So we asked in a global survey, 9,000 people, we gave them 6 head, 6 hand, and 6 heart characteristics. And we said, what do you want most in a leader? #1, heart. #2, heart. #3, heart. #4, heart. #5, a hand, okay? What's not here? Head. And it's so interesting when you look at the data, and this is analysis of transformations a colleague of mine did. When you look at the data, most of the attention leaders give during their transformations is to head. Next most is hands, and least is in heart. So most wanted, least done. And then you see, though, when you do heart, so this is sustained performance, right? If you don't do any of these well, there's a 1 in 3 chance your transformation will succeed. If you get the head right, where most of us spend attention, that doubles, but it triples when you add the heart and the hand. So hopefully I just needed to put a little plug in for heart. Okay, Martin, do I have time for one more?
Yes, I think you do, Debbie.
All right, let me do one more double click. Ways of working. Okay, so this is the perseverating on days a week in the office. Let me say a couple of things on this. It's the wrong thing to focus on. And the irony is, I just put an article out on Forbes earlier this morning, so a couple hours ago. The irony is that with all the people saying return to office, they're still hybrid. They're still hybrid. They are even like 98% of Jamie Dimon's organization is still hybrid. It's the executives he asked back 5 days a week, which is a mistake. I have an opinion, right? And so let's acknowledge that the world is now hybrid, okay? Let's acknowledge that. The focus has to be on how to make the hybrid work really work. And the analogy I use with organizations is to say, okay, imagine you want to move your entire technology infrastructure from mainframe to cloud, or from desktop to mobile first, right? And you wouldn't just issue a memo and say, okay, now we're going to move to cloud and mobile first and think it's going to happen. You actually have to invest in making that transformation happen. Well, when it comes to hybrid working and ways of working, humans are even harder than machines. You can't just write code and have everyone respond the same way. We're all different. We all come from different backgrounds. As I said, different things motivate us. And so these are the 5 steps that we've developed over the past 3 years of working with organizations on this topic that are required to make that investment in making hybrid work really work. I'll go through them really quickly. One is, get your leadership team aligned on what are you solving for? What is the problem we're trying to solve by, through our working models? And once you identify that, what are the guardrails that you're willing to give your organization? And then empower your business leaders, your leadership team, or even the leadership team below them, to say, okay, how do I apply that in our work? Because work is different, right? Working in a factory is different than working in an office. Doing marketing is different than doing technology. Coding, doing technology is different, than doing finance. And so, we've worked with tech teams that said, okay, there's 1 sprint, we're all together. There are 2 sprints, we're all apart. Or finance teams, we're together the 3 or 4 weeks at the end of the quarter when the books close, right? But that rest, you could be apart. Marketing is more like we need to be in a room together, brainstorming 1 or 2 days a week, right? So empower leaders to make it match the work. So that's number 2. Number 3 is recognize, okay, well, the teams need to adapt it for their own individual needs. Like maybe they all have small kids and they need to shift the hours, like the nurses, to start at 10 and go later, or maybe the work that week is different. And so you've got to empower the teams to adapt the work and give them tools and training on how to do that. And then number 4 is the most important from my perspective. It's then investing in the enablers to make these models work, right? Just like you can't shift to the cloud without investing in new technology and new capabilities and new work processes, you cannot invest in this without better manager upskilling, communication and collaboration stack, the team norming tools, and the senior leader role modeling. It's a problem with JP Morgan Chase. If every single leader is in 5 days a week, they're going to fall down on the hybrid work they promised the other 98% of the organization, because they'll see, oh, my boss is in, then I need to go in. You need leaders to role model exactly the way the rest of the organization works. And then finally, measure the results and measure whether it works or not, because you aligned on what you're solving for. And let me give you a hint: badge swipes, attendance, FaceTime is not typically a result that correlates with corporate performance. Okay, I could go a little deeper on these, but in the interest of time, let me wrap it up and we could open up for Q&A, Martin. Just a couple of points, in summary. One is organizations still need to fight and win to keep the best talent. They should focus on making work better for all workers, not just those in an office. They should focus more broadly in those buckets of how you work, how you lead, how you organize, and what you need. leadership is the most important thing and the hardest to do. Back to generative leadership and the heart, the role of heart. Heart got shown a lot during COVID. Why are we putting it back in the closet? And then don't stop after setting policy. When organizations actually invest in enablement, they start to see results. And I can give you examples of this that create a talent advantage. So let me stop it there, perhaps, and open it up to some conversation.
Thank you very much, Debbie. So do post your questions in the Q&A box. Let me maybe get things started with a question from me, Debbie. In tight labor markets, I'm sure that a lot of the flexibility that employers are demanding will be given. It probably does all sorts of useful things in terms of efficiency and effectiveness. I'm wondering if there's what's the connection between the practices you talk about and the possibility of sustainable advantage, the connection to strategy?
Yeah, well, listen, if you look at the economics of organizations, for most organizations in most industries, a significant percentage of your expenditure is on salaries, is wages, right? Like, so economically, people say, if people are your greatest asset, people are your greatest asset. And I think it was, Google who put out there years ago the notion of, outpaying for outperformance. And they documented like the value of a high performing employer can be 10 times the value of an average performing employer. And we know that, Martin, in our work, you're always looking for the rock star in your team, right, to pull everyone else along. And so even if the labor market is not tight, the ability to attract, retain, motivate, and keep the best of the best is still a source of competitive advantage. It is your biggest asset base, for all but the very capital intensive industries.
All right, excellent. So that seems to have done the trick. We've got some questions flowing in. So I've got a question from Johannes, which is, are there any productivity differences between single person-led households and family households when it comes from working to home?
It is interesting. We looked at some data on productivity, self-professed productivity in our early surveys, where like at the beginning of COVID, we asked people like to rate their productivity. And then we tried to cut it by female, male, married, single, caregiver, not caregiver. And to be honest, we didn't see huge differences there. I suspect now, obviously, if you have other responsibilities at home around caregiving, you have to be more innovative about when and how you get your work done. I just put a paper out a couple of weeks ago, there is a caregiving crisis, at least in the US. And so that is something that needs to be addressed. But in the productivity impact of moving from office to home, we didn't see any macro effects. I will tell you, in our latest research, we put this, as you know, Martin, our What the Flexibility survey out on LinkedIn. You just find me on LinkedIn, you could find the survey. And we've gotten about 1,500 responses to that survey. And what is very interesting is we ask people, we break it down by task around saying, where are you most productive for, focus work, administrative work, collaborative work, coaching, team building, culture building, right? And what's very interesting from that data is that regardless the type of work, there are people who prefer to be in the office for those types of work. And so I do think like there are characteristics like introvert versus extrovert, which are really important. I know colleagues in COVID who they need to be around people to get energy, and being home was really hard on them. And so I imagine them having kids at home is probably better because they at least get some energy there. Just a hypothesis.
All right. So I've got another question from Atanu, if I pronounce that correctly. Did your study cover multiple countries, and did you observe the differences in priorities for job switching from country to country?
Yeah, there were some differences. We covered multiple countries. The first time we did the research, I think we covered 7. The next we did 4. There were some mild differences, but not major differences, actually, on the emotional pieces.
Yeah, we've got a question probably on the edge of the space here from Alfred, who asks about the work of managing layoffs. How do you best manage layoffs?
Yeah. So there is a lot there. And there's been some stuff written about actually, companies not doing layoffs because at the end of the day, it costs you a lot of money to lay people off. It's a little sticky depending on the country you're in. And actually, bringing people on board to manage costs and all get out of the problem together is an interesting alternative. That wasn't your question. How do you manage layoffs? With compassion, with heart, with empathy, with support, with transparency and honesty every step of the way. And I've worked with companies and, going through that. And it is amazing the difference between layoffs done well and layoffs done poorly, email done.
Yeah, we've got a question from Roberto, and maybe we might need a bit more context in the chat from you, Roberto, on this one. But the question is, what is your assumption on the self-interest in corporate strategists? Do we need a bit more information there, Debbie?
Yeah, I could read that a couple of ways.
Roberto, do you want to amplify your question in the chat, what you mean? But we have a question from Pekka, who asks, and you may want to go back to one of your slides, Debbie. You give 4 areas, critical areas in question 2, and the Pekka says he takes those for granted, but what he's interested in is how these areas causally related, and how do we dynamically incorporate them into managing a business as a whole. So I guess he's saying sort of beyond the list of the 4 things, the answers to question 2, how do they relate to each other, and how do you put them into practice holistically?
I'm not sure what question 2 is.
I'm guessing it's your 2. You highlighted 4 areas in a stacked bar chart.
Oh, the how we work and how we lead and how we organize and what we need. Yeah.
Well, you had 2 emotional things and two functional things, I think. And,
okay. Yes.
And so how do they relate to each other, and how do you holistically put them into practice?
Okay, so let me put this up here and make sure we're all talking about the same thing. Share screen. There we go. So I'm assuming, whoops, let me get my mouse back to my, why is it not going up here? Hold on, let me stop share for a second. Let me, All right, I'm gonna try again to share this slide. All right, now we got it. This one, right, Martin?
I believe so. That's got 4 things.
Yeah, so they totally relate. It's an excellent point. When you put in emergency daycare on site for, factory workers, right? It is basically showing people they're valued, they're appreciated, they're supported, right? And so the things you do to demonstrate the emotional are often functional, right? Because how many people actually need the emergency daycare? A tiny fraction of them, but it delivers, first of all, a security, right? Like if there's a problem, I could use the emergency daycare, but it also conveys an emotional support message in the functional stuff you do. So they are totally connected, right?
I can identify, Debbie, with this idea of how do you holistically manage these things, because if you ask me to recite all the benefits that my company gives, I probably wouldn't know. I probably only remember half of them. It's very complicated as bits and pieces. How do you holistically manage a set of interventions like this?
Yeah, so there's well, one, and I didn't share perspective or slides on this, but there's some really important work. This is at an aggregate, but if you go to the next level and think about segmentation, right, that not all employees are the same. I mentioned that, right, and Gabby Novichek's work on applying consumer segmentation to employees and what you see when you do that, because it gets back to the benefits. So she did some work for a large retail organization where there was a large LGBTQ percentage of the population. And when they looked at their benefits, they weren't geared towards that population, right? And they were missing some things. And then there were a lot of things they thought they offered very generously that didn't apply to that segment, right? And so, and so they needed to, really manage it like you manage a product portfolio, right? It extends the customer analogy into thinking about, okay, yes, there are lots of bits and pieces that Martin Reeves, you may not value, but there are two things I need to do then. One, manage the portfolio, making sure you're getting the things you value.
Yes.
Two, manage the communication to make sure you're aware of all the product features, right? Yeah, exactly.
So manage it like a business, essentially. Make sure people understand it and segment and measure the effectiveness and all of that good stuff. Okay.
Yeah.
So we have an amplifying comment from Roberto on his question on self-interest. He says, I think we need to see people as they really are, self-interest in new ways of working, and how leaders and strategists are under societal pressures to manage self-interest. So I'm understanding that as, would it be a self-interested thing to do the things that you talk about? And I guess that's almost the opposite nuance too, which is, are we talking about the suppression of self-interest? Or is it essentially talking about acts of caring? I imagine both could be true, but where does self-interest come in here? So essentially, I guess you've talked about stuff which is you need to do to respond to labor pressures. You've talked about stuff which is useful to do, in whose interest?
Yeah, I love that question. And thank you for explaining it, right? There is a dynamic that has gotten worse around us versus them, management versus employee. And yet you can see the power of when it changes around to we're all in it together. We're all in it together. So KKR, actually, very interestingly, I forget the name of the company, but when they monetized it, they made sure every single employee got the value of that, right? And so they're into, distributing the wealth so it doesn't just go to the team at the top, right? But they're thinking about that's the ultimate example of aligning everyone's interest, that we want to make this company as productive as possible because we're all going to win. We're all going to win. I could give you another example, Red Hat. When Jim Whitehurst, left his role as COO of Delta Airlines after turning it around after 9/11, command and control leadership, and he was hired as CEO of Red Hat, an open source technology company. He was like, what is my job here? It's like a cult. Like, everyone just likes to be at work. They work hard. They love the problems they work on. They literally have Red Hat tattooed on their arms, right? And so they're all so passionate about what they're doing. He's like, he wrote a book about it called The Open Organization. My job as CEO is to give the direction, interface with the external world, raise money, and then remove barriers for people that get in the way of them doing the stuff they love. And I put those out there as two different models of shifting from a us versus them, we all have competing self-interests, to we're all in there together with a common set of goals. And it's the job of management and strategists to say, identify that overlap in the Venn diagram of what can we all align behind and be passionate about, right? And one of the things COVID made worse, back to my deskless and office-based workers, right? Frontline versus corporate, is, the corporate people work from home, and the front line are still in the plants and driving the trucks and in the, hospitals, and it's getting worse. How do we close that gap? We need to close that gap. And so one, crazy idea I put out there is make hybrid workers happy by shutting down all the corporate facilities, but telling them they have to get together 40% of the time. But when they do, it has to be at a plant, in a store, in a distribution facility, in a restaurant, like wherever. And so you start to bring the worlds back together socially.
So it looks like that's the last of the questions, although if anybody's got a burning question, I think we can get one more in. So maybe a final one from me, Debbie. So you said that you were not talking about the future of work because it's already here, but I think there are some longer term things going on too. And let me give you a straw man to react to. So I scanned a couple of management magazines before this session to try to get a sense of the future of work. And I guess my straw man would be, we're all going to be out of work because of AI. We're not going to be able to get we're not going to be able to find any young workers because society is going to be aged. The developed economies are going to be in terminal decline of growth rates, and probably the premium from globalization is going to disappear because we're all going to become regional and siloed. So relative to that, slightly absurd straw man, how do you see the longer term future of work?
So Martin and I did not plan this. I guarantee it. There were 3 slides I skipped because I was tight on time. At least addresses one of them. So everything I talked about is how we work, right? How work should work. There's a whole separate bucket about the work we do, right? And what is the role of AI in redesigning work, in the new roles and skill sets we need to do prompt engineering, blah, blah, blah. And then what does that mean for a career and a lifetime of employment, right? And so, so that is a little bit of the tomorrow. I think the how we work, which I talked about, is today. But there definitely is a tomorrow, and how generative AI and other technologies impact the work. I didn't answer the other geopolitical forces you talked about, the demographic ones, but maybe I tapped one of them.
Very good. Well, thanks so much, Debbie, for touching on this important topic that affects us all, and maybe dispelling a few myths and giving us a few things that we can implement, whether we work in a university or a company. And thank you for everyone for participating in today's session so actively. And we'll see you again at the next Strategic Imagination Forum.
Thanks for having me.